So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today the College of Ministry senior speaker. He's a nice guy. I think you're going to like him. Daniel Blakeslee is graduating this year with a degree, a major in pastoral ministries. And I'm really excited. He just this past February, just last month, because it's still March, was hired on to be the youth pastor at Bellevue Neighborhood Church. So we're really excited about that. It's always great when you major in something and then actually, get hired to do that work. That's always a very good thing. Daniel has served as one of our mentors in our summer journey program for high school students, and I've worked with him there. And he's just, as I said, an all-around nice guy. He's got a word to share with you today, so will you welcome Mr. Daniel Blakeslee.
Thank you, Dr. Ziefel. That was a nice way to introduce me. So, hey, I'm Daniel Blakeslee. Good morning to everyone here, the few, the proud that came and came out to chapel this morning. Didn't have to wear your pajamas to chapel. You chose to wear actual clothes and make the effort to come down. And good morning to everyone watching online who might be in your pajamas. That's great. That's awesome. You can love the Lord in your pajamas as well. I believe it. We all did that over quarantine, right? So no one's to judge. But hey, good morning. I am very excited to share with you. And before we dive in, I realize there's these two ideas in life. There's one that is expectations, and then the other is reality. And a lot of times when we look at this, it's kind of funny to realize that the two don't always line up, right? You have your expectations, and then you have reality. And so I thought it would be funny to think about, how does that apply to Northwest? How does expectations and reality kind of apply to Northwest? And so I came up with a list, I guess you would call it. The first one that I wrote down was that maybe coming into college, you were in high school, right? And you're like, class starts at 7 a.m. So the expectation is that taking an 8 a.m. Is a great idea. You get to sleep in, you get to go to class, your classes get done before noon, and then you hit the reality, which is 3 weeks into the semester, and you are completely exhausted, and you can't imagine waking up any time before 10:30, right? Maybe you have this expectation of, I'm going to take 18 credits, I'm going to work a full-time job. I'm going to maintain completely healthy relationships. And then the reality is that homework actually fills all spare seconds of every single day, and you felt like you haven't had free time in years, right? Maybe you have the expectation that, especially here at NU, you're like, I'm going to go against the grain, right? I'm going to pursue an education, and I'm not going to worry about relationships. And then the reality sinks in, and you find yourself engaged when spring rolls around, right? Feels like everybody's on that boat right now, including me. So, or you find yourself doing the opposite. You have the expectation of coming to school and finding your spouse, finding the one you're going to spend the rest of your life with. It's going to be so romantic. You're going to meet in Gray Beatty. It's going to be beautiful playing ping pong together till 2 a.m. And then the reality that you find out is that love is actually a lie. And there's no one here for you. And the NU bubble just does not provide the people that you might need for your future spouse, right? Maybe you have this expectation that if you move from out of state or just further away from this area, that living near Seattle is going to be amazing. You're like, I'm going to live in the city. It's going to be awesome. And then you go into downtown Seattle once, and you realize this reality that it's awful. Right? If you've ever driven around Seattle, you'll know there are aggressive drivers. There are extremely steep hills with people that stop way too close behind you on those hills. There's so many confusing roads and one-ways and roads that are roads for cars, but they're actually only for buses, and it just makes no sense, and it's just pretty awful, right? Maybe you have the expectation, if you're in the dorms, you have this expectation that me and my floor mates, we're just gonna hang out all the time, and we're just gonna have so much fun. And then you get to the reality of whoa, I actually crave alone time. Isn't that weird? And then the sucky part is, and I can't ever find it. I have no alone time in the dorms. You can't find it ever, right? We all have expectations for areas of our lives, right? And a hard part of life is realizing that those expectations are not always the reality. And this reminds me from a man in the Bible. His name is Abraham. And, Father Abraham, he had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, if you know that old song. And for those of you that didn't grow up in the church, you're like, what is that? And I apologize. But no, Father Abraham, he had expectations for his life. In Genesis 15, verses 4 through 5, we see these expectations. It says this, "Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood. They will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." So Abraham had these expectations for many, many sons, many, many children that would go and be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But the reality was much different for a time. When we jump forward in Abraham's story to chapter 22, in the first 2 verses of chapter 22, we see the reality of what Abraham faced. It says this, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.'" So Abraham had this expectation that he was going to have many, many offspring, as many as the stars in the sky. And when he gets to the reality, God makes it very clear that Abraham does not have many offspring at this point in time. He says, "Take your son, your only son, the one whom you love, Isaac." God names him in case Abraham tried any funny business of getting around it, right? Abraham's like, "I don't know who you're talking about." He's like, "Your only son, the one that you love, Isaac, if I have to name him to be more specific." And God tells him to go and sacrifice him. Abraham's reality was much different than his expectations. And we're going to explore kind of how Abraham got between the two. But at first, I wanted to open and tell you guys a little bit about me, all right? So I am from Everett, Washington. Is anyone from Everett? Woohoo! It's about 30 minutes north of here. It's a great, awesome town. And I was born into this great and loving family. And when I was younger, I had an expectation for my life, right? That expectation was this. I was going to grow up, and I was going to become a wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. That was my expectation for my life. And in case you can't tell from looking at me, God did not bless me with the same physique as DK Metcalf. If you've seen him, that man is a monster. And me, I am just me, right? You don't see me, you can't picture me out there getting tackled by anyone. I would break and die. And so in high school, my expectations changed a little bit when I realized, I'm not going to be 6'7" and blessed with all the muscles in the world. My expectations changed, and I felt like the Lord had started to call me to ministry. Which I would say is more important than being a wide receiver, so whatever. God bless me there. But at first, I didn't take it very seriously. And then it became clear to me that God was taking it seriously. And so I started to find my passions growing in serving others. I found joy in ministry. And so I set down on this path to pursue becoming a pastor. And that led me here to Northwest. So I applied here, and the funny thing is I actually didn't even apply to any other college. I was like, this is the place. I just was so confident that God was leading me here, and that this was the place that could provide me with the education and everything that I needed to move forward into becoming a pastor. And so 18-year-old Daniel arrived on campus, and just full of all the hopes and all the expectations in the world. I was ready for this journey. And to be honest, I had actually probably planned out in my head what the next 4 years was going to look like. I was I had this expectation that at the time, I was a student ministries intern at my church, which is the church that I grew up in. And I had this expectation that I was going to, at some point transition to staff. And then by the time I graduated, I would be the middle school pastor there, alongside the current youth pastor. I had this, expectation that by the time I graduated, my family was going to stay completely healthy over my time here. I had this expectation that my time at NU was going to be some of the best and most easygoing years of my life. And we all have come into this place, this room, this school, with expectations. And so I want to ask you, what are the expectations that you have or that you had for your time here? Maybe you expected to come here and find a true place of belonging. Maybe you expected to come here and find a calling to a career path. Maybe you came to NU with expectations that your faith was just going to explode and deepen. Maybe you came here and expected to walk through and find answers for your struggles that you had. Maybe you expected to come here and just experience no hardships, from classes or no hardships in life in general. And maybe, if you're like me, you came to realize, or you will come to realize, that those expectations are not the reality of what happens. And so going back to Abraham, like I said, I really believe he is the perfect example of this. So Abraham, like I said, he had great hopes for his life. And one expectation that he had hoped for was for a child. But let me set the scene right a little bit. Him and his wife, Sarah, were old. And when I say old, I don't just mean like the way you call like your 26-year-old brother, like old. I mean like old, like in their 90s old. And if you know anything about the human body, people aren't just cranking out babies at that age, right? So they could not get pregnant. And the thing about Abraham's hopes and his dreams and his expectations, it's that they were not founded on nothing. It wasn't like Abraham was just like, someday I'm going to settle down, have kids, and it's going to be great, and just that's kind of what I hope for my life. No, Abraham's hopes and dreams were founded in promises made to him by God. Right? We are told in Genesis chapter 15 that God promises Abraham that he will be the father to many nations. And again in chapter 17, God says this again to Abraham. And actually in chapter 17, Abraham has the audacity to laugh at God. He laughs at God when God tells him that he will be the father to many nations. And he laughs, like I said, because it just seemed so ridiculous that he, a 99-year-old, as the Bible tells us, would have a child with his 90-year-old wife. And later in chapter 18, Sarah herself actually hears that she is supposed to have a child, and she laughs too, because it seemed so ridiculous. But sure enough, in chapter 21 of Genesis, Isaac is born. Their son Isaac is born. And I want to break it down a little bit further because I think it's really important to understand what they walked through in order to understand the weight of what happens in chapter 22 in the story of Abraham and Isaac. So like I said, Abraham and Sarah could not have children. They had been married for a while. And let's just say, back in those days, they did not waste time, right? They didn't have the same idea as marriage as we do, right? Like they had a big world to fill up. And there was not a lot of time to waste just not having children. And so Abraham and Sarah, they tried and tried, but they could not have children. And I believe even at one point, Sarah is talking to God, and she's like, "You've made me barren." And they obviously wanted children because Abraham cries out and argues with God. He's like mad, and he says like, "My cousin," or wherever, he's like, "that person will be my heir," which is when God responds and says, "No, they will not be, but rather you will have a child." And he's upset, but he keeps telling God, but God keeps telling Abraham that he will be the father of many nations. And so Abraham was filled with expectations and hopes that he would finally have a child. And so they waited. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they even got to the point where, like I said, the idea of them having a child was laughable. But God kept his promise. Abraham and Sarah got pregnant, and they had their son, Isaac. So let me ask you, what is your greatest hope in life? We all have something that we hope will happen in our lives. And we can even call it an expectation at some point, right? I shared mine with you earlier that coming into college, I had hoped and expected that I would become a pastor at the church that I grew up in, my family would stay healthy, and that my time at NU was just going to be easy breezy, right? And now imagine that goal, whatever it might be for you. Imagine that expectation you have in your life finally being like reached and attained. Imagine reaching and achieving that hope or that goal. This is the feeling that Abraham and Sarah had when they had finally had Isaac. They finally had what they had waited and waited on, what they had hoped and had expectations for. They had their child. And it probably feels really good, right? To achieve that hope, to achieve the expectations, the things that you desire for in your life. And in chapter 22 of Genesis, the expectations of how their family would grow up together, the expectations for the life that they had for their child would all change dramatically. Because God wakes Abraham up one day and he tells him, "Abraham, you got to go and sacrifice your one and only son, Isaac." Their expectations were just shattered. Their hopes are just crushed. Put yourself in their position, right? Think about the feeling of reaching your expectations, reaching your hopes, achieving your dreams and your goals, and then all those things get taken from you. To some extent, this is kind of what I walked through at my time at NU. That goal of wanting to become a pastor of the church that I grew up in was shattered as I experienced a lot of church hurt, a lot of pain that led me away from that place. That took me away from the community and the only community that I ever had known as a church. And a few months prior to that, my hopes of a healthy family had also been shattered as I had lost my only two remaining grandparents, and my mom was diagnosed with a pretty serious medical condition. And so, safe to say that my dreams of an easy time at NU had come crashing down. They had all been shattered. And in these moments in our lives, I believe that we are faced with two options. This is my first point, is this, that when reality is not what we expected, we can either trust ourselves or we can trust God. When reality is not what we expected, we can either trust God or we can trust ourselves. Because when reality changes from what we had always wanted, from our expectations and our hopes and our dreams, we are either going to trust ourselves in what we want in the situation, or we're going to trust God in what he is doing in the situation. And when we trust ourselves, we go against the change that is happening. We fight against it, and we do everything in our power to achieve what we want. Think about Jonah in the Bible, right? Jonah wakes up one day and God tells him, you got to go to Nineveh. And Jonah says, nope. And he says, I'm going to go in the other direction. And he does exactly what he wants. He trusts himself in that situation more than he trusts God, and so he runs in the opposite direction. Think about Adam and Eve in the garden. They were asked to trust God. They were asked to enjoy their time there, eat from the splendor of the garden, but just don't eat from the one tree. And instead of trusting God and what he had set up for them, they trusted themselves and they ate from the tree anyway. And it's safe to say that these two stories, the people, they did not end up in ideal situations, right? Last time I checked, no one is trying to check out the belly of a whale on Airbnb, right? No one's trying to go and stay in the belly of a whale or of a big fish. And last time I checked, no one ever bragged about being kicked out of the presence of God, right? They find themselves in not ideal situations. And for us, trusting ourselves in these moments in our lives, these decisions, these flipped realities, it might look something like this. It might look like running away from faith. It might look like fighting against the change that is happening in your life. It might look like refusing to let go of the hopes or ideal expectations that you had. It might look like unhealthy attachment to people or to things. Maybe for you, it looks like blatantly doing the opposite of what you know is good for you because you're hurt and you're confused and you don't know why everything that is happening is happening. And to be honest, the easy path is to trust ourselves and is to do that. Because when we trust ourselves, we do not have to embrace the hardship that is before us or around us. When we trust ourselves, we do not have to sit in the uncomfortability and uncertainty of change. When we trust ourselves, we can do whatever we want to do and be okay with that. But as we observed, trusting ourselves doesn't always lead to the greatest of outcomes. And so we're left with the other option, which is to trust God. It's to look at reality, how it has crashed your hopes and your expectations, and to choose to have the audacity to say in those moments, I trust you, God, in what is happening. And this is what Abraham decides to do. We jump a little bit further in his story. Like I said, he wakes up, God says, you need to go sacrifice your son. And Abraham could have very easily been like, I'm okay with where my life is at. I'm okay, I have a child, I have what I've wanted. Me and Sarah are happy, we're content. But instead, he chooses to trust God, and this is what he does. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 9, starting in verse 9, it says this. When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said this, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Abraham chose to trust God in the middle of his hopes being destroyed, and God came through. God did not leave him alone. God showed up, and he blessed Abraham because of how Abraham followed God. But like I said, what Abraham did was extremely difficult. It would have been much easier for Abraham to wake up that morning and to not do what God wanted him to do, because he had received what he wanted. Him and Sarah had a family. They were content probably with their child, and he could have said no. But Abraham trusted the Lord. Abraham trusted God, and he followed him. And because of Abraham trusting God, he was blessed greatly by the Lord, right? Because in that passage, the Bible doesn't just say, well, okay, I'm going to bless you no matter what. God says to Abraham, he says, because you have not withheld your son, because you have followed me and trusted me, I will bless you. See, trusting God in these situations will always be difficult, but I'm sure of this one thing, which is my next point, that when God is leading you somewhere, it will always be better than where you came from. When God is leading you somewhere, it will always be better than where you came from, even though the process of getting there might be painful. Right? I like to think about it this way, and maybe it will help you understand it a little bit. Has anyone ever driven down to like Southern California or Disneyland? And ever done a road trip and gone from like up here and then driven all the way down the coast, right? Every single summer, my family would do this trip. And one year particularly, we were able to not just drive down to see family who live in California, but we were able to go to Disneyland, right? And I love Disneyland. I could preach about Disneyland, not really. But Disneyland, like I said, it is literally the greatest place on earth, and I will argue about that, right? But when we left for this road trip, right, when we would leave on this road trip, we left our home. We left the place that we were comfortable in, like my room, our house. And, there are parts of the drive from Everett, Washington to Anaheim, California that are uniquely beautiful, for sure. But there are also many extremely dry, flat, ugly parts of that drive. And when you're young, like I was, and you're driving through what seems to be a desert, and it's like 105 degrees outside, and occasionally your car doesn't have AC because it breaks somewhere in the middle of Oregon, it doesn't seem all that worth it. It doesn't seem all that worth it to be on this road trip anymore. You almost forget where you're going. But when we arrived, it was all worth it, right? The car sickness, worth it. Getting all sweaty and being uncomfortable and getting mad and fighting with your siblings every 10 minutes is worth it. The long stretches of boredom and heat are all worth it because the destination was amazing, right? And now I'm just talking about going to Disneyland. I'm not even talking about the plans that God has for your life, right? When God is taking you somewhere, I'm certain that where he is taking you will be better than where you have come from. But sometimes the distance, the travel that you make, the journey that you're on will not make it seem that way, right? Because you're going to be in moments of your life where you're in these transitions, where your reality is being changed, and you don't know where you're going, but it is ugly, and it is hard, and it is messy, it is uncomfortable, and it hurts, right? But if you trust God and you follow him through it, I am confident that where he is taking you will always be better than where you come from. It will always be better than where you come from, because this is my main point is this, like, trusting God will always be worth it. It will always be worth it. Trusting God in our hurt, in our pain, in our confusion will always be worth it. When our realities change and our hopes and our expectations are crashed and shattered around us, and you choose to follow him in that mess, it will be worth it. Because wherever he leads you will be better than where you came from. Like I said, when I left my church full of hurt and confusion and pain, I wanted to trust myself. I wanted to turn away from God and do my own thing. But people around me, probably I was blessed with a community that pushed me to trust God, pushed me to take those steps of faith. And when I did, God brought me to a place of healing. He brought me to a new church community where I experienced healing, I experienced joy, I experienced bouncing back from everything that I had walked through, and it was beautiful. I had this new church family that deeply loved me and cared for me, and I felt joy in church, and I felt joy in serving again. And I would have never experienced that if I only trusted myself. I would have never experienced that unless I trusted God and followed him in where he was taking me. And if I'm being honest, you know what happened after that? I had a whole new set of dreams and expectations and hopes, and God did the same thing as he shattered them. And he pulled me away from that community into a new community where I am now, because he called me into leadership at Bellevue Neighborhood Church, where I am right now. And I did not want to leave my church. I did not want to leave that new reality that I loved and that I was comfortable in again. But I decided to trust God again, just like that worship song we sang earlier, right? Like, I've seen you do it, and I believe you're going to do it again. I trusted that he was going to do it again, and so I went where he was leading me, because I know that it will be better than where I came from. So it'll always be easy to trust yourself, but trusting God is the only way to experience what is going to be best for you. And so as I wrap up here, I just wanted to challenge you with something. Maybe we could all do this together, all right? I want you right now to think of an area of your life where you're experiencing this sort of change. Maybe your first year here at NU has not been what you expected it to be. Maybe you're feeling pain and confusion because you thought you'd be further along in your life goals right now. Maybe you have a lot of stressful events coming up this summer. Maybe you're getting married. Maybe you're walking through stuff with family, and all those dreams, expectations, and things you have are just too much for you to handle at the moment. Maybe you're experiencing roadblocks that are stopping you from achieving something. Whatever it might be, I want you to give it to God. I want you to decide right now that you're going to trust God in that situation. Do not withhold your hopes and dreams and future from God. Hold it with an open hand and give it to him, to trust him with it, right? We're told that when we trust God and we lean on him, he will make our path straight. We're told that God is working for your good and that he can bring you to a new destination if you trust him and you follow him. So my challenge is to hold your expectations, your hopes, your dreams with open hands and decide right now, I'm going to trust God in it. I'm going to follow him. Let me pray us out. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this word you've spoken, God. I thank you for all the students here at NU. I pray over all of our hopes, all of our dreams, all of our desires for our life, our plans. God, I pray that they are within your will and that whatever you want to do with us, I pray that we trust you with it. God, I pray that you encourage these students and you strengthen them in the midst of their confusion or their pain or their hurt to still trust you. God, give us strength. We love you and we trust you with our lives. In your name I pray. Amen.